Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 12, The Great Tunal. I'm Brandon Seale. The men ran through the grasslands in their woven fiber sandals, some naked, some covered with only a loincloth made from deer or rabbit or coyote hides. They weren't so much fast, however, as they were persistent, and they were coordinated. The little doe running in front of them had tried everything she could to evade them, but at each turn there was another man waiting there to meet her. Occasionally she would stop and try to disappear in plain sight, but before she could even start panting, the tribesmen would be upon her once again, pushing her ever closer to the shoreline. These Native Americans that Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes lived with during the winter of 1532 and 33 weren't as tall as the others that the expeditionaries had encountered back on Galveston Island. They weren't as good with bows and arrows either, but if everything went according to plan on this hunt, they wouldn't need them. The idea was to drive the doe into the bay and let her drown there, making everyone's job easier. And by this point, after almost a day of following behind this little doe, they had pushed her into the sand dunes on the beach. The men from further behind began to catch up, and soon they formed up in one great long line. They flushed the doe one last time from a stand of beach grass, and the doe realized that she was out of options. Her pursuers were just a few dozen yards away now, and her only escape was into the gentle surf of the Gulf. She bolted with one last surge of energy and leapt into the waves. Then she panicked. The water was deeper than she'd expected, and the waves were a new sensation to her. In her panic, she began to flail, expending what precious little oxygen remained in her lungs. And by the time she went underwater, she was already dead. The doe would feed this little native band for several days, and really was a rare treat. The Indians of South Texas, when compared to the Indians of the upper Texas coast, enjoyed very little variety in their diet. Quote, their main foods are 2 or 3 kinds of roots, and they search for them all over, but they are very bad and they cause bloating, end quote. Over the years, they had learned to grind certain foods to preserve them, like mesquite beans or dried fish, desert flowers, even old bones. But in lean times, according to Cabeza de Vaca, quote, their hunger is so great that they eat spiders and ant eggs and worms and lizards and salamander and snakes and even vipers who kill men when they bite them. And they eat dirt and wood and anything else they can find, including deer droppings and other things that I'd rather not detail. I honestly believe that if there had been rocks in that land, they would have eaten them too, end quote. Though methodologically incorrect, it is tempting here once again to try to connect these natives in 1532 with the Coahuiltecans that later Europeans would find in the same region of South Texas. The label Coahuiltecan was imperfect even in the 1700s, however, as the tribes in this region were so diverse and so different that many of their languages were even unintelligible to each other. Still, we can make some broad generalizations. The Indians of this region lived in bands of maybe 20 to 50 people, occupying poorly defined but fiercely defended territories. They had to move frequently, every 2 or 3 days, to avoid overtaxing the resources of any given area, though their possessions were so few that moving was not an unduly difficult process. Their houses were simple tents, hides laid upon 4 bent sticks driven into the ground. As with the natives of Galveston Island, quote, the men don't carry burdens or loads, which is done by women and old men, whom they value the least, end quote. Continuing, quote, their women get only 6 hours rest each day. All the rest of the night they pass tending to their ovens to dry out the roots they harvest. And as soon as they wake up, they begin digging for more roots and carrying firewood and water to their houses, end quote. Cabeza de Vaca also tells how infanticide, particularly of female babies, was especially common amongst these subsistence-level tribes. The rationale that they gave to Cabeza de Vaca for the practice was that in a world of, quote, continuous war, end quote, they preferred to see their girls dead than captured and, quote, made to bear children who would one day become their enemies, end quote. All this being said, the natives of South Texas faced the grimness of their lives cheerfully. According to Cabeza de Vaca, they, quote, are a very happy people, And even when they're starving, they don't stop having their dances and parties and rituals, end quote. And there was one time of year in particular that they all looked forward to. The great prickly pear harvest, or tunal, at the end of every summer. Tuna is the Spanish word for the fruit of the prickly pear. Quote, the best times that these people have is when they eat tunas, because then they aren't hungry, and all the time they pass dancing, eating them day and night, end quote. For 3 months out of every year, these Indians ate nothing else. They would squeeze the juice of the prickly pears into a pit in the ground and drink from it, the soil imparting just a hint of additional sweetness to the juice. For University of Texas archaeologist Thomas Hester, the pit in the ground is actually a clue. Pots and ceramics are readily found and even referenced in Cabeza de Vaca's description of the Indians up the coast. Yet if you get far enough down into South Texas, into the sandy plains around Brooks County heading toward modern-day Lake Falcon, pottery and ceramics pretty well disappear from the record around this period. And the Brooks County area, by the way, is home to some of the largest concentrations of prickly pear in Texas. Indeed, before the arrival of set stock cattle operations and before the Great Freeze of 1897, prickly pear thickets dominated the landscape, rising in some cases many stories up into the air. The 4 former Narvaez expeditionaries had been told all this, and so they too had come to look forward to the Great Tunal of 1533. Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban had been reunited again 7 or 8 months ago in late 1532 during the pecan harvest along the lower Guadalupe River. There, they resolved to try once more for the Rio Panuco, which they were closer to at this point than they had ever been so far, a mere 500 miles or so through some pretty inhospitable terrain populated by even more inhospitable people. Given these challenges, they decided it'd be best to wait until the prickly pears bloomed the next summer, when they might be able to live off the fluorescent pink fruit as they moved across the land. And so they resigned themselves there in late 1532 to 7 more months of slavery and split up. Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes went with one band, and Castillo and Esteban went with another. But all of them committed to reunite somewhere in South Texas in the late summer of 1533. It was no small thing for these 4 men to put off their escape for 7 or 8 months. The 4 expeditionaries were at the bottom of the social hierarchy in the tribes with which they lived, and their keepers made sure to let them know where they stood. Here's Dorantes bluntly describing their situation. Quote, "We had not security for life from one day to another," end quote. Dorantes tells about tribesmen appearing armed in front of him, without warning, in an apparent rage, quote, pointing an arrow at his breast, drawing the bow to the ear, and then laughing and saying, "Were you frightened?" end quote. During his captivity with these Indians, Cabeza de Vaca relates how he was relegated to mosquito prevention duty. The mosquitoes in South Texas were so thick, in Cabeza de Vaca's words, that if you did nothing to protect yourself, you woke up looking like a leper, red, swollen, and eaten up. To ward off the little bloodsuckers, the natives made a ring of campfires out of wet wood and tried to keep them smoking all night long. And this eye-watering duty was almost always assigned to Cabeza de Vaca. If he fell asleep or if the fires went out, he could expect a beating. According to Cabeza de Vaca, quote, "I can affirm that no work in the world equals it for suffering," end quote. It was no small miracle, then, that all 4 men were still alive in the summer of 1533. Though held by different bands, they had managed to stay in contact, presumably because their bands were close by each other, and again suggesting that their slavery wasn't without some freedoms. They must have watched closely throughout early 1533 as the little green prickly pear buds started to appear on the nopales, blossomed then into bright yellow flowers in the spring, and then transformed once again into deep purple fruits that ripened slowly as the days grew longer. Finally, when the sun was at its highest and the land was at its driest, the deep purple fruits began to shade into pink, and that's how they knew it was time to move. Sometime maybe in August of 1533, they made it back to the prickly pear ranges deep in South Texas. When the expeditionaries got there with their respective bands, the 4 of them managed to reconnect without too much trouble and began to devise a plan. They decided they would slip off and attach themselves to one of the tribes whose home ranges lay to the south, so that when they left the Great Tunal, they would carry the 4 expeditionaries along with them, closer to the Rio Pánuco. Quoting Cabeza de Vaca, quote, "My companions told me that in no way should I let the Indians learn of my plan to move on, because they would kill me for it," end quote. For a solid month or two, they managed to keep their secret while they and their bands went about filling their bellies. But then, just as they were about to spring their plan into action, a fight broke out between the very bands of Indians by whom the 4 expeditionaries were being held. It started, they tell us, over a woman, but that's all the detail we get. Whatever happened, it soon broke out into blows and ended with each Indian storming off huffily and telling his tribesmen to pack up their things. Suddenly, the Great Tunal of 1533 was over, or at least it was for the Indians holding Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban. Quote, "And so we Christians had to leave as well," end quote. The 4 expeditionaries were once again going to be split up amongst various different bands. And once again, they were going to have to wait another year until they could try to leave this life, until they all came back together at the Great Tunal of 1534. This had to be absolutely crushing. This isn't like missing the Rolling Stones on tour, but they'll be back around next year. Taking up Cabeza de Vaca's own language, this is like being told you're going to be released from prison after a half decade, then told there's been a glitch, and you've actually got to wait a whole nother year. It's the kind of thing that breaks most people. 2 episodes ago, we talked about Viktor Frankl's anecdote from Auschwitz, about a fellow concentration camp prisoner who had convinced himself that the camp would be liberated on a particular day. And when that didn't happen, he just collapsed in on himself and died. And that, by the way, is about what Cabeza de Vaca suggests the feeling was like, being sentenced to an extra year in a concentration camp. It's curious to me that 3 of the 4 survivors of a 600-man expedition, I'm talking here first about Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, and Dorantes, seem to come from a very similar background and seem to have demonstrated some kind of real affinity for each other. Recall, Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, and Dorantes all came from the lower to middle nobility back in Castile, and they'd been paired up on multiple previous occasions to lead scouting expeditions back in Florida, to lead counterattacks against natives in Mississippi, and each had been given command or co-command of one of Narvaez's 5 rafts. Now, you can come up with a cynical explanation for why 3 noblemen out of maybe an initial 80 should have survived this expedition when only one, Esteban, of the other 520 did. Back on the beach in Florida, there's the suggestion that some of the noblemen refused to partake in the manual labor of building their little flotilla of rafts. The clue is actually buried in Cabeza de Vaca's discussion about how the crew slaughtered a horse every 3rd day to feed those who were laboring to build the rafts. Quote, "But I could never eat of them," end quote. Is Cabeza de Vaca saying here he didn't like the taste of horse flesh? Or is it because he wasn't doing any of the labor and so didn't qualify for the meat? Was he at least supervising? It's hard to imagine him just sitting on his hands. We don't really know. But you could make some assumptions based on this detail about how workloads were distributed amongst the very class-conscious Castilians, and deduce that maybe the reason the 3 noblemen survived was because they always hung back and made the commoners do all the dirty work. Certainly, this would take a toll on men's bodies, and maybe that's what goes on in the first winter on Galveston Island, for example. The problem with that theory is that it doesn't explain the next 3 or 4 years that Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, and Dorantes survived as slaves. It's pretty clear that they weren't spared any hard labor during those years of servitude to the subsistence-level tribes of South Texas. And those, frankly, are the years that really fascinate me, because the ordeal in those years seems as much psychological as it does physical. One thing that I can't help but notice is that all 3 Castilians had received some kind of education. Just that all 3 of them were literate places them in a distinct minority for their time. But in the previous episode, we also found some evidence that they all conceived of their faith in a similarly developed and intellectually nuanced fashion. And again here, concentration camp survivor Viktor Frankl has some perspective. He has a theory about educated people in extreme situations. Quote, "Sensitive people who are used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain. They were often of a delicate constitution. But the damage to their inner selves was less. They were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy makeup often seem to survive camp life better than did those of a robust nature, end quote. And again here, I recall the example of Lope de Oviedo, originally one of the hardiest of Cabeza de Vaca's crew, who ultimately collapsed in on himself in despair. He had the willpower and he had the strength to survive, but maybe it was some intellectual tool that he lacked. So what could it have been then about Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, and Dorantes' education that prepared them better for the suffering that they endured, or at least for the psychological part of it? Today, we don't think of overly educated people as being particularly well prepared for hardship, but here I'll note that education had different goals at different times in history. Here's a quote from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's written a really great book called Flow, detailing the clinical findings around, well, what makes a good life worth living. Quote, "At certain times in history, cultures have taken it for granted that a person wasn't fully human unless he or she learned to master thoughts and feelings," end quote. Continuing here, quote, "Unless a person knows how to give order to his or her thoughts, attention will be attracted to whatever is most problematic at the moment," end quote. This seems to be what we see Cabeza de Vaca doing in his narrative, and frankly with his narrative, ordering his thoughts and his feelings, but I can't really offer any more specific evidence than that. It's a nice idea though, isn't it? That part of our education should be to learn how to suffer and how to prepare for it. Of course, none of this education-based theory of suffering explains Esteban. We of course don't know Esteban's actual education, but more than likely, he hadn't had the benefit of the kind of education that the Castilians had. Then again, many of the things that the Castilians were experiencing for the first time and as the worst possible forms of treatment may have been things that Esteban had already suffered in his life as a slave on 3 continents now. In the words of our friend Andrés Resendez in his book, A Land So Strange, quote, "The man best able to cope psychologically with the adverse conditions was in all likelihood the African, Estebanico," end quote. Indeed, many modern interpreters of Esteban have liked to imagine that he might have been enjoying the role reversal of seeing his master reduced to a slave as well. Because we don't have an account written by Esteban, we don't have the same window into whatever coping techniques that he might have used to deal with his hardships. We can make some inferences, however. We keep noticing that Esteban is really adept at picking up languages and at learning how to communicate with the various native bands. Maybe this was Esteban's way of keeping his own mind active and engaged, and not dwelling on the arbitrariness of the world that kept tossing him and his companions around. There's undoubtedly something special about these 4 men, and certainly part of what happened was that they grew together during their time alone in North America. They knew that their strength came in unity, and so before their respective bands left the prickly pear grounds once again, the 4 of them made a commitment to each other to meet back here next year in the summer of 1534. Same time, same place. By giving themselves a goal, and by reminding themselves of their duties to each other, they were giving themselves the strength to endure what they knew was going to be a really, really hard year. On the next episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and think this is a story worth sharing, please tell one friend. And if you haven't already, please go rate and leave a review for us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache and was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andrés Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.